אני מאמין, אני מאמין, אני מאמין, אני מאמין. באמונה שלמה בביאת המשיח, ואף על פי שיתמהמה, עם כל זה אני מאמין, ואף על פי שיתמהמה, עם כל זה אחכה לו. אני מאמין, אני מאמין. On the night of November 9th, 1938, there was a pogrom against the Jews throughout Nazi Germany. On this one night, almost 100 people were killed. 30,000 men were arrested, and over 1,000 synagogues were burnt. This night came to be known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, to bring to mind the shards of shattered glass that lined German streets in the wake of this state-sponsored pogrom. Broken glass from the windows of synagogues, homes, and over 7,000 Jewish-owned businesses looted and destroyed during the violence. Thank you for being with the Florida Holocaust Museum this evening as we commemorate Kristallnacht together with a short service and a program featuring Dr. Mark Wygoda. My name is Elizabeth Gelman. I'm the Executive Director of the Florida Holocaust Museum, and I will be your moderator tonight. We began our commemoration with the lighting of 6 candles, symbolizing the 6 million Jews who perished during the Holocaust. As I turn to Rabbi Joshua Lobel from Temple B'nai Israel to lead us in the traditional Jewish mourner's prayer, the Kaddish, I want to quote from the recently departed Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. Today, we say to the souls of those our people lost in Europe's dark night, we will never forget you. We will never cease to mourn you. We will not let you down.
יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך, לעולם ולעולמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומן ויתנשא. ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקדושה ברכו. לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דאמירן בעלמא ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום, עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן.
It has been 82 years since Kristallnacht, and sadly, we continue to hear echoes of the hateful rhetoric and actions of the past. May we carry the memory of Kristallnacht with us through the rest of the year to remind ourselves of the universal lessons of the Holocaust and to foster a shared culture of remembrance. Thank you to Rabbi Lobel for leading us in prayer, and thank you to Holocaust survivors Helena and Ed Herman for assisting us with our virtual candle lighting. Before we begin our program, I'd like to take a moment to thank a few other people, including Fawn Walker, Community Outreach and Programs Manager, Amy Alvarez Baruch, the museum's designer and technology guru, Rachel Freeman, Marketing and Communications Manager, Director of Collections and Interpretation, Aaron Blankenship, and Director of Education and Research, Ursula Shapinska. Thank you to our board chair, Mike Eagle, and our board and advisory committee for their leadership and passion for the museum's mission. Many thank yous to our members and donors for your continued support as we turn to our virtual portals to continue educating adults and students on the lessons of the Holocaust during this critical time. And finally, thank you to the Holocaust survivors who are with us tonight. Your stories are the ones we honor, not only inside the museum, but throughout all our programming as we work to use the lessons of the Holocaust to create a better future for all. Thank you so much for sharing your stories and your strength with us. Before I introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Mark Wygoda, I want to ask everyone who is watching to wait until Dr. Wygoda is finished speaking before typing questions or comments in the chat section below. There will be plenty of time for questions once Dr. Wygoda ends his remarks, I promise. Dr. Mark Wygoda is a professor in the biology department at McNeese State University in Lake Charles, Louisiana. After attending both Emory and the University of South Florida, he earned his doctoral degree from the University of Florida. His father, Herman Wygoda, was a German-born Polish Jew who began his defiance against the Nazis as a smuggler to the Warsaw Ghetto. Mr. Wygoda moved to Berlin in early 1943, where he worked undercover for nearly a year, then escaped to German-occupied Italy, where he joined the Italian Partisans, becoming known as Commandante Enrico, commander of an assault brigade, and later an entire division. I don't want to tell you too much more, except that after the war, he received decorations from 3 nations, including a Bronze Star from the United States. So you know this is going to be an amazing story about an amazing man, told by the son who edited his father's memoir. Please help me virtually welcome Dr. Mark Wygoda.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the Florida Holocaust Museum for inviting me to be your guest speaker tonight. You will learn that my father was both a Holocaust survivor, a resistor, and a rescuer tonight. I hope you find my presentation both fascinating and inspirational, and I will now begin. My father, Herman Wygoda, came to the United States in 1946. He married in 1947. I was born in 1951. Now, when I was growing up, I knew next to nothing about his life in Europe before he came to the United States because he never talked about it. And before I tell you about that life, I would like to tell you why I am convinced he never talked about it. This picture was taken on my 8th birthday, and you can see how happy I was, but look at my father, look at his expression. His thoughts were clearly elsewhere. I know now that on my 8th birthday, he was thinking about another son he once had who was murdered when he was 8 years old. I distinctly remember the first time I ever learned of the existence of Samuel, my half-brother. I must have been maybe 4 years old. I was in our parents' bedroom. My mother was in there doing something, and suddenly I found myself face to face with this little picture in a frame on the nightstand on my father's side of their bed. And I turned to my mother and I said, "Who is that little boy?" She turned around and with a very stern look on her face said, That was your father's first son. He was killed in the war. Don't ask him any questions. So believe me, I wasn't about to ask him any questions. And later I learned from one of my sisters that our father's entire family had been killed during the Holocaust. So I didn't ask him questions. When I was a child, I was too afraid. And then later, I still didn't ask him anything because I wanted to not have him go through the agony of remembering. The only time I remember asking him anything, I must have been in about the 4th grade of school, and at recess, the other boys on the playground were talking about what their fathers had done during the war. So I came home that afternoon, and all innocence came up to my father, who was in his office, which was our home, and I said, "Daddy, what did you do in the war?" Well, he pulled open a drawer and pulled out a few pictures, and this was one of the pictures that he showed me. That's him with the binoculars around his neck. He told me he was a guerrilla fighter in the mountains of northern Italy. And I had no idea what he was talking about. I'd never heard of a guerrilla fighter. And he explained to me that guerrilla fighters were those who fought behind the enemy lines. And of course, these are the partisans. I asked him what was his rank and did he win any medals? And so out of that drawer came these 2 items. On the left was a patch that he saved from his partisan uniform. That insignia indicates he was a lieutenant colonel in their army. And on the right, you will see the American Bronze Star Medal that he was awarded after the war. The only other thing that I remember asking him, was he ever wounded? And he said, yes, he was wounded. And he pulled up the pant leg on his right leg and showed me a scar on the back of his calf. Now, he led me to believe that he had been wounded when he was fighting with the partisans, but no, he intentionally misled me. I found out much later that he had been wounded several years before in Poland during a failed attempt to rescue his son Samuel. So even though he never talked about it, I do know what happened, and that was because he was able to write about it. And his memoir of the Holocaust has to be, if not the first, but one of the very first to ever have been written. He began writing it in 1945 in January, when he was living in a cave in northern Italy. And I refer to it sometimes as his diary, sometimes as his journal, sometimes as his memoir. But this is a picture of it. It's all written in Polish. I can't read a word of Polish, except I can make out one word in there, and that's on the second page. The last word on the first paragraph is Treblinka. He started writing, going back to everything that had happened to him since the first day of the war, and he continued writing up to the present, and then continued past that point, and actually wrote some after the war ended. Well, he brought this with him to the United States when he came in 1946. He came here, he couldn't speak a word of English. He didn't know any English, but 20 years later, he himself translated this entire journal into English and left for his family a typed manuscript. And it was 11 years after he passed away that I was finally able to spend the time working on editing his English version with the goal of publishing it as a book. And here is the result. In the Shadow of the Swastika, my father is the author. I am down as the editor, and the publisher, the University of Illinois Press, arranged with noted Holocaust historian Michael Berenbaum to write the foreword. So with that introduction to my father's life when I knew him, beginning when I knew him, I'll now talk about his life before he came to the United States. Hermann Wygoda was born in Offenbach, Germany on November 18th, 1906 to Jewish parents, Hannah and Meyer Wygoda. Hannah is the lady seen there holding his hand, and the other lady you see is one of her many sisters. Her name was Goldie. Now, after Hannah's husband Meyer was killed in World War I, she took Hermann and his little brother Leon back to her hometown in the little town of Kossaw, Poland, which is about 50 miles east of Warsaw. Leon is shown here much later with Hannah. He remained in Kossaw, became a cabinet maker, and he married, and the couple had 3 daughters. My father attended Warsaw Polytechnic Institute and became a civil engineer. All I know about what he did is he specialized in bridge construction, but he took his first job back in Germany, in Berlin. But he left Germany in 1929 to come back to Poland because of the rising anti-Semitism that he was witnessing almost daily. There in Poland, he married, and the couple had a son, Samuel. Well, they separated later, and my father and his mother, Hannah, together raised Samuel. They lived in an apartment building in downtown Warsaw. Well, in the late summer, 1939, my father knew that war was imminent, and he thought it would be far safer for his son and his mother to be in that little town of Kossaw with Leon and his family. So he sent them there, and he remained in Warsaw. He was in Warsaw when the Nazis invaded. He survived the bombardment, and he survived the siege of the city, and he watched as the first German soldiers marched into the city. Here's a photograph I found that was taken on that day. My father was somewhere there watching this happen. Now, almost immediately, the Germans started issuing anti-Jewish laws that had taken 6 years to fully enact in Germany. They were put into place in a matter of weeks in Poland. My father refused to obey all of their laws. Instead, he went underground, assuming the identity of a Catholic Pole, but not just any ordinary Catholic Pole. No, my father posed as a Volksdeutscher, someone who had German ancestry, Aryan ancestry. He credits his success at this to his language skills. He said he could speak German with no trace of an accent. And time again, that saved his life, but also the lives of others, including some who lived in the Warsaw Ghetto. This is a picture I found of the Warsaw Ghetto. This was a section of town, downtown Warsaw, which before the war was home to about 145,000 people. In 1940, the occupying Germans forced all the non-Jews to move out and forced all the Jews of Warsaw to move into this section, but not just Jews of Warsaw. All Jews who lived in outlying cities and towns and villages and just in the countryside, they were all forced to move there under penalty of death. And as you can see, there's a wall around this section. The Germans built, I believe it was a 10-foot high masonry wall, topped with broken glass and barbed wire. It became a prison, effectively. At the height of the Warsaw Ghetto, there were 500,000 people in there. People were dying of disease and starvation all the time. My father became a smuggler to the Warsaw Ghetto. His operation consisted of going in there and leaving with valuables such as gold and diamonds and furs, selling them to farmers in the countryside in exchange for food that he would smuggle back in. Now, in his memoir, he doesn't say exactly how he got in and got out of that place, only that he used what he called secret passageways that were reserved for professional smugglers only. But he did write about what he saw when he walked the streets of the ghetto, the dead and the dying lying out on the sidewalks. He said every time he left, he wondered if he would have the courage to go back in there again, but he did. He kept going back in. He said the ghetto drew him in like a magnet. And I know from reading poems that he wrote late in his life that it was the children that he was mainly trying to save with the potatoes and other food items that he took in. Well, in summer, I think it was July of 1942, he had been away from Warsaw for a while. And when he got back, a friend of his gave him a warning. This is his friend. His name was Stanislaw Gorczyca. He was a real Catholic Pole, a good friend of my father's. Stanislaw told him that if he was going to go into the ghetto again, this time he needed to be extremely cautious. Stanislaw told him that strange things were happening in the vicinity of the Danziger railroad station, which was the closest station to the ghetto. He told him that the Germans were busy assembling all available freight cars, and strangely, they were covering the air vents on those cars with barbed wire and heavy boards nailed from the outside. Nobody knew what was going on except the Germans, of course. They knew what was going on. But nevertheless, my father went in again. He said this time the situation was very different. There was a lot more tension in the air. And whenever a German patrol was spotted, everyone, including my father, ran for cover. The people told him that lately the Germans were shooting into the crowds indiscriminately. Then in the distance, he saw what looked like a large crowd of Jewish men and women being led by German guards, and everyone fled. My father barely made it into an apartment building before the door was slammed shut behind him. Now, in that crowded lobby, every once in a while, he was able to make his way to the door to look through one of the peepholes. And what he saw outside was a column of Jewish men and women, he estimated 18 to 20 people wide, being marched in the direction of the railroad station by German guards with bayonets fixed to their rifles. He said it took about 40 minutes for this whole procession to pass by. Then he went back out into the street and continued along his way, only to be caught up in another crowd of people running like mad. This time he witnessed the murder of a young Jewish man out on the sidewalk by a Nazi SS officer. That convinced him it was far too dangerous for him to be in there again. He left and he never returned. Now, before I continue in this chronology, I'm going to back up a couple of years for just a few minutes. Around 1940, once when he was visiting his family who were now confined in a very small ghetto in the town of Kosovo, he was arrested by the Polish police. Well, he got out of that, but he became a wanted man. And if they were to spot him, they would kill him. They'd probably kill his family too. So he wasn't able to visit them very often. And when he did, it was always in secret. Well, now I'll come back to where I left off when he left the Warsaw Ghetto for the last time. It was soon after that that the Germans liquidated the ghetto in Kosovo. And they took his entire family away to Treblinka, and they were all killed. Now, his inability to save them haunted him for the rest of his life. Well, sometime after the Warsaw Ghetto incident, he found himself working at a German border patrol camp. Now, this was the time when the Russians were occupying the western part of Poland and the Germans the eastern part. So there was a border between the two occupied zones, and that's where he was working, at a border patrol camp. He was working alongside another Jewish man who was hiding in plain sight. The man on the left is that man I was telling you about. His name was Leon Peregol. His family had been killed. But together, the two men made a very good team that helped assure their mutual survival. Leon's talent came from the fact that before the war, he was a professional photographer and he was an artist. And with his talents, he was able to alter stolen ID cards beyond detection. That ID card that you see there is one that Leon carried in 1943. And that very evil-looking man whose photograph is attached to that ID card, that's Leon. My father referred to him as a master of disguise, and you can see what he was talking about. Well, my father's contribution to the team came from his language skills and his bold nature. He was incredibly bold. And I'm going to give you one example of how his language skills and his bold nature saved their lives. Well, someone at that border patrol camp became suspicious of them and reported them to the Gestapo. They found out about it and left immediately. They boarded a passenger train bound for Warsaw. And along the way, they received word that the Germans were taking people off the train at the railroad stop in a town called Lukow along the way. You see, this was 1943 now, and the Germans were facing a labor shortage at their war factories back in Germany, and they resorted to making slave raids into Poland. They weren't looking for Jews. Jews were either already dead or in concentration camps or on their way to concentration camps. They were taking ordinary Polish citizens into slavery. So what my father did is at the last stop before Lukow, he got out of their car, called Leon to follow him, went out onto the platform and just looked around. And he spotted in the middle of that train they were on, there were 2 railroad cars reserved exclusively for German citizens. And with no hesitation, he walked into one of those cars. Leon right behind him. Inside, there were 4 Germans, 2 civilians and 2 military men. My father greeted them with a Nazi salute, and he and Leon sat down and made themselves comfortable. Now, Leon sat there holding his fist against the side of his chin, pretending he had a toothache so he wouldn't have to do any talking, because he knew very little German and he had a Polish accent. My father immediately started engaging those men in conversation. And when the train pulled into the railroad station in Lukaw, my father said they were engaged in a loud and lively conversation. This is that railroad station. It still exists today. This is a contemporary photograph I found. The train they were on was parked on those railroad tracks. As soon as the train stopped, a loudspeaker came on issuing orders, first in German and then in Polish. In Polish, they told the passengers, get off the train, take all the belongings with you, leave the doors to your compartments wide open, report to the main waiting room in the station. Failure to obey, you'll be shot to death. But in German, the message had been very different. In German, they told the passengers, stay in your cars, lock your doors, don't let anyone in. We'll be leaving shortly. It took about a half an hour for those poor Polish folks to all leave the train with their belongings. And during that time, a conductor came by the car where my father was sitting there with Leon and the Germans, greeted them with a Nazi salute, apologized for the inconvenience, wished them well, and said, we'll be leaving shortly. And soon thereafter, the train took off for Warsaw. Now, soon after that, the 2 men together, my father and Leon Perregol, went to the last place you'd expect Jews to go to seek refuge in Nazi-occupied Europe in 1943, and that, of course, would be Berlin. There, they were working undercover, of course. Why Berlin? Well, you don't expect Jews to go there. And in the foreword to my father's memoir, Michael Berenbaum states that safety is often found in the eye of the storm, and that was certainly the eye of the storm. Well, there they worked for a company, a skilled labor recruiting company. My father had various roles with the company. At times he was a translator, at times he was a foreman, and at times he was an armed courier taking company money and documents to different countries in Europe. Leon worked for them as a draftsman. Now, this company was owned by 2 businessmen, both of whom were members of the Nazi Party, and they liked my father. In his role as a courier, he once took a trip to far northern Finland to a company mining camp. And on that particular trip, he took with him a teenage Jewish boy who he had discovered among a group of newly recruited workers. And with false papers properly filled out by Leon, that boy, whose name we don't know, he found himself working in a place of relative safety. In his role as translator, my father was assigned to a mining camp under construction near the town of Jovi in Estonia. Well, he asked his bosses if they could assign Leon there too. He claimed Leon was his cousin and he wanted Leon around, and they liked him, so they sent Leon there. He and Leon at first were considering trying to escape to the Russian front, but they gave up on that idea when a couple of other guys tried to do it. They were caught by local hunters, returned to the camp where they were hung to death in front of the camp office as a warning to others. Well, about 6 weeks there, after about 6 weeks, my father asked his bosses if he could take a leave of absence, and well, they said sure. He wanted to go back to Warsaw. He said he wanted to see his friends, but especially see if he could help get anyone out of what he called that terrible place. Now, the day he arrived was May 12th, 1943. That was during the final week of the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt. And that was the day that the Germans set fire to the ghetto to drive out the remaining resistors. I found this picture that was taken at about that time. after the Germans had set fire to the ghetto. My father watched this, what he called desperate but unequal fight, for 4 days. He was staying in a friend's apartment, a friend named Frank, who lived right across the street from the ghetto, and he watched this through the window. Well, with the help of the Polish underground, he was able to get hold of 2 teenage Jewish boys with false documents supplied by the underground, and he took them back to Yovi with him. Well, it wasn't long after that that both he and Leon were reassigned to the company office back in Berlin. And there he was constantly reminded of the dangerous situation that they were in, because right upstairs from their company office, in that office building, there was a Gestapo unit. And my father would pass the Gestapo agents every day going up and down the stairwells. He was terribly frightened, but he never showed a trace of fear at all. Well, he and Leon knew they were bound to be discovered sooner or later. They needed to get out of Germany. Well, their ticket out of Germany, so to speak, came thanks to the Allies. The Allies were now bombing Berlin. And after one particular air raid, the company they worked for was given a contract to clear out the rubble from a bombed out government building. Notice I said government building. My father was put in charge of the job, but he went in first to snoop around, and he found what he was hoping to find. He found blank ID cards, blank travel documents, and official government stamps. With these documents filled out properly by Leon, the 2 men could go anywhere they wanted within the sphere of German influence. So in December 1943, they boarded a passenger train and arrived in the Mediterranean port city of Savona, Italy, without incident. Now, this is the time when the Germans were occupying northern Italy. This is after Italy had switched sides during the war, and the Germans were now in northern Italy. This is a contemporary photograph of Savona, Italy. Well, there they worked for a construction company, and they felt relatively safe, but my father wanted what he called complete freedom. And even though Leon tried to talk him out of it, he planned his escape to the island of Corsica, which was then occupied by the Americans. He bought a motorboat, he hired 2 ex-Italian Navy men to navigate, and he acquired weapons on the black market. He said he was not going to be taken alive. But in the early morning hours of February 12th, 1944, he was arrested in his hotel room by the German secret field police. This was the military equivalent of the Gestapo. 5 men, a captain, a sergeant, 3 enlisted men made the actual arrest, while other soldiers stood guard outside. They took him downstairs, put him in the back of a German staff car, drove him to the military garrison in Savona, questioned him for hours, and of course he maintained his innocence. Then they locked him in a cell. He escaped that night, went up into the mountains to the northwest of Savona, where he lived in a cave. And in this contemporary photograph, I've indicated with an arrow the location of that cave. He lived there for several weeks. He heard from farmers in the countryside that Leon too had been arrested. Well, after a few weeks, he was approached by a group of armed men, and he knew who they were. They were the Partisans. They asked him to come with them, and of course he went with them. They took him several miles away to a house where he met a high-ranking officer in the Italian Liberation Army who persuaded him not just to join the Partisans, but to assume command of a group that was active in those mountains but had lost their leader. Well, he agreed. And thereafter, he became known only as Comandante Enrico. All the Partisans went with assumed names. He decided to call himself Enrico. Here you see Comandante Enrico, my father, in the middle of this picture. In the background, you see the cave that he had hidden in. He turned that into his command headquarters. Now, initially, he was put in charge of a detachment of about 100 young, inexperienced, ineffective volunteer freedom fighters. His first act as commander was to reorganize his outfit and instill discipline in his troops. With his leadership, they started becoming effective. Initially, they were fighting only with single-shot rifles, but soon they found themselves fighting with captured German automatic weapons, and later with British and American weapons that were airdropped to them by the Allies. In this photo, my father is seen holding a British-made Sten submachine gun. His forces planted mines, they blew up bridges, but mainly they aggressively attacked enemy convoys and troops that were passing through the mountains. As they became successful, more and more local Italians joined. His numbers swelled. He split his detachment up into several detachments and then later regrouped them into 4 separate brigades, each with its own brigade commander. He himself assumed command of the 4th Brigade of the Garibaldi, which contained his original detachment, as well as several others, for a fighting force of about 600 men and a few women partisans. Later, the High Command ordered him to join those 4 brigades together into a single unified fighting force, a division. And that is how my father became a division commander in the Italian Liberation Army. He had about 2,500 troops he commanded. Now, as a partisan commander, my father, he had the control over life and death. His usual procedure for dealing with captured Germans was to personally interrogate them and then order their execution. He says in his memoir, "In all candor, I have to admit that even if I had possessed the facilities necessary to maintain a prisoner of war camp, the Nazis would definitely have been excluded from such camps. In my opinion, the Nazis were not entitled to any benefit derived from international law or any other custom practiced by civilized people anywhere in the world. But sometimes captured Germans proved useful as pawns in prisoner exchange negotiations, and my father carried out prisoner exchange negotiations with a German commander in Savona. They sent communications back and forth, and the letters that my father sent to him, he wrote himself in flawless, grammatically perfect, and quite eloquent German. That commander must have been absolutely furious. He came to the false conclusion that there was a German traitor up there leading the partisans against him. Once the commander and his troops, the German commander, tried to attack and destroy the resistance, they failed miserably. My father and his troops drove them out of the mountains after they lost 87 men compared to my father's loss of only 5. Never again did they try to attack Comandante Enrico. On April 25th, 1945, my father led his troops down out of the mountains and helped to liberate the city of Savona. This photograph was taken 1 week later on May Day. And you see my father is wearing his full partisan uniform. There's the military patch I showed you in the beginning on his chest. He never wore that when he was up in the mountains. As a commander, you wouldn't want the enemy, if they captured you, to know who you were. Well, prior to this liberation that took place the previous week, he had 200 of his partisans especially trained to be police officers. And upon the liberation, he established himself as chief of police of Savona. And he essentially controlled the city for several weeks. He said the police in town were corrupt, they were collaborators. So he was the police chief. After about 2 weeks, the regular Italian army finally arrived. And here you see my father standing rigidly at attention at a ceremony that took place in the town square, where he is transferring control of the city of Savona over from partisan army to regular Italian army. He is facing a colonel of a regiment that arrived. With that accomplished, he tried to settle into a normal life as he could. He became a police inspector for the city of Savona, but soon he began receiving awards and decorations, including this Certificate to the Patriot. You can all read that, it's in Italian, but Certificate to the Patriot. This was issued jointly by the British and Italian governments. The last sentence translates, "In the reborn Italy, the bearers of this certificate will be acclaimed as patriots who have fought for honor and for freedom." This was his partisan veteran's ID card that was issued to him in conjunction with that certificate. This was the first legitimate ID card that he had carried in 6 years. So he became a police inspector for the city of Savona. About a year later, he received this telegram that arrived at the police station. It's asking that the below named individual be informed to report to a certain address in the city of Milan, Italy, on the 25th of June, this is 1946, to receive instructions concerning the receipt of an American Declaration for Valor. The last sentence translates, he is advised to wear his partisan uniform. So my father went, and there he is in the middle. He was awarded the Bronze Star Medal for Valor in Combat by United States General Mark Clark. And I would like to conclude my presentation by reading to you my father's recollection of that event. He said, General Clark, then stationed in Vienna, had come down to Milan expressly for the presentation. The event had a special meaning for me, as English was one of the many languages with which I was unfamiliar. I did not understand what the general was saying, nor could I express my thanks to him for pinning that medal on my chest. But the thought that General Mark Clark could do this for me, could give me an American decoration when I had never seen his country, prompted me to select the United States of America as my new home. My thoughts were of an ancient Polish slogan, Za wolność nasza I wasza, for our freedom and for yours as well. I thank you for your attention, and I will be happy to answer any questions you may have at this time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wygoda. That was, what a fabulous story. What an experience your father had. Before I ask a question, I want to ask our viewers to go ahead and submit questions through the chat function below, and I will pass them on to Dr. Wygoda. While you are doing that, I have a question myself.
Okay.
Everything we do at the Florida Holocaust Museum is really grounded in the over 20,000 artifacts and testimonies that we have in our collections. So I am particularly interested to know if you have any artifacts of your father, especially from those partisan days, that you would be willing to share with us tonight.
Yes, yes. Let me show you something I have here. You see this holster and gun belt.
Wow.
Okay. There's a story behind this. There was a teenage boy in Savona who was doing some anti-German propaganda, I believe it was. He was captured by the Germans, put into a cell, and he was so small, this guy was tiny, that he slipped between the bars. He was that small.
Wow.
Went up into the mountains, found the partisans. They took him to my father. My father issued him that gun belt and told him something like, you're a little bandit now, someday you'll be a big bandit. The Germans called them bandits. And about 60 years later, that man gave the gun belt to our family, the same object. So that's one of the items I have here. I do have behind me his Bronze Star Medal. In that last picture I showed, he was holding this box in his hand. And the medal was pinned to his chest, but the medal is in the box right now.
That's amazing. Well, thank you for that. We've got some questions coming in. Stephen asks, and I think a few other people, so what happened to Leon?
Oh, Leon, yes. Leon was a survivor. Leon, he was arrested later that day. My father was arrested in the morning. Leon was arrested in the afternoon. He was put into the same prison with my father, but he was put into a cell on the second floor. My father was in the cell on the first floor at the same time, and they didn't know each other were there. But my father escaped, as I said, that night. Well, Leon knew he was going to be arrested because my father had been arrested already. So he smuggled a file into prison with him, some kind of small file. And every day when the American bombers were flying over Savona on their way to some bombing mission, the German guards would go hide in the bomb shelter. He would whip out that little file and start filing the bars on the window of his cell. And one day, there were some painters down in the courtyard who ran off into the bomb shelter, left their ladder laying on the ground, and that was just the perfect time because he pushed the bars out,
Oh my
jumped
God.
out of the window, picked up that ladder, put it against the wall, scrambled over the wall, went up into the mountains, had no idea my father was somewhere in the mountains, but he went to a farm family, confided in them. And after maybe a week, he started walking to Switzerland. So he walked all the way to Switzerland to freedom. He was in bad shape when he arrived. He had frostbite, he had pneumonia. It took him years to recover, but eventually he emigrated to Canada. He could never get a visa to come to the United States, but he did make it to Canada, and I met him on 2 different occasions. So he was a survivor.
Wow. Every story is so amazing. That's been my experience. It's just
Yes.
the survivor stories are amazing. There's a question we're getting from, you talk about your father escaping from jail. How did he escape from jail?
Okay, they put him in a cell that had 2 deserters from the German army in the same cell. And he tried to convince them that they needed to get out of there. They were kind of suspicious of him at first, but then he showed them the pistol that he had smuggled into the cell.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, he says he didn't know why he did it, but he always wore a small pistol strapped behind his right knee under his trousers, and they did not search him properly. They put him in that cell. He still had a gun. So he devised his escape plan, and he got cooperation from the German prisoners. They waited until 9 o'clock that night when the guard changed, and my father, well, he didn't go out for lunch that day. He was sick, so he was laying in the cot moaning. One of the Germans went to the door and got the guard's attention, said, "That man in there, he's sick, you need to come in." The guard comes in and goes right up to my father. My father pulled the gun on him. My father knocked him out with the gun.
Wow.
They tied him up, and they had his keys. So they all escaped, went out into the courtyard, and my father had devised this plan earlier. He opened the door to the latrine, which was sitting against the wall, and they used the door as a ladder to scramble up over the wall. And that's how he escaped that night.
It's amazing. Wow. Neil asks, what kind of work did your father do when he got to the United States?
Yes, he became a general contractor. He specialized in the construction of single-family homes. He built hundreds of homes in Chattanooga, Tennessee is where I was born. And he established the Wygoda Building Corporation back maybe in 1950.
Mm-hmm.
And until he retired in about 1972, he had not just built homes, but entire subdivisions. He developed subdivisions, designed the homes, supervised their construction, and he was his own real estate agent to sell the houses.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Talk about an incredible success story.
Yes.
David asks, where did your father meet your mother?
Well, when my father, he came to the United States, he first went to New York. That's where the ship landed. He had an aunt that came to America long before the Holocaust, stayed with her for a while. He had another aunt who lived in Chattanooga. And that's why he went to Chattanooga. And then when he first started his business, he went to Sam Rader Plumbing Company to purchase what he needed. And my mother was the secretary. Sam Rader was her father.
Oh, wow.
She was a secretary, and that's how they met.
Wow, that's a lovely story. Here is a question about, did your father ever go back to visit Italy?
Yes, he did. He did. It was probably around 1970. He and my mother both went to Europe, not just to Italy. He went to Germany. He found some people that he knew when he was there in the 1940s, reunited with some people who had helped him. Went to Italy and reunited with many of the partisans that served in his command.
Oh my gosh.
So yes, he went back.
Were you able ever to meet some of these people who served with your father?
Yes, I did once. There's a research institute in Savona that studies the resistance during World War II. And they approached me about translating my father's memoir into Italian for them to publish and give away to schools and people who served in my father's division. This institute doesn't sell anything. And I do have a copy right here.
Oh, wow.
This is the book in Italian.
Wow.
Okay. And in conjunction with what they called a book presentation ceremony, they staged an exhibition on my father's life in, in City Hall of Savona. And so they invited me. I went. It was a fabulous experience. They did an incredible exhibition on his life. I met several of the partisans who served in his division. And they actually took me up to the command cave one day, and I was able to go inside the cave. It was an incredible experience.
Unbelievable. Wow, great that you had that experience. So here's another question. You talked about your father speaking perfect German. Did he speak Italian as well?
Not originally. When he first got to Italy, he couldn't speak Italian. He had a knack for languages. I think in his life, he could speak 8 different languages. I think that's the number. But when he first got to Italy, he said the company that they worked for, and he set it up in advance as if they were being sent as representatives from this company in Germany. So they were accepted. But there wasn't much work in the beginning. He spent all his time learning Italian. And when they put him in command of that detachment, he was able to give a speech, and he got great applause from whatever he said. It was pretty amazing. Yes.
That's quite, what a talent. What an amazing, I mean, really, what a useful talent during that time. Just definitely unbelievable. We have one more question, but before I ask it, I want to remind everyone that we would appreciate if they would fill out a short survey. There's a link in the chat section. Not only do these surveys help us evaluate our programs for our own sake so we can continually improve, but they are in fact necessary for compliance with the grant funding that has generously been given to us to fund programs like this. So if people who are watching can look and click on the survey and take it, it will take you literally, 2 minutes to fill out. We'd appreciate it. All right, one last question. And the question is, I have 2 questions. I'm sorry. A quick one was Ursula, who who is our Director of Education and Research, wants to know about the original manuscript. Do you have the original manuscript as well?
I'll hold it up and show you. This is it. This is the
Oh, wow.
You see, I don't know if you can read it, but up at the top, it's 1939. That's where he started in his memory back to the first day of the war. And I'll just flip through it. That's it right there.
Wow.
That's it. Yes.
Wow. Just that we believe so much. I mean, I believe so much in the power of those objects. It's extraordinary. So here's the last question. And that is, did the partisans know that your father was Jewish when they asked him to take over?
Oh, no, they didn't know when they asked him to take over. No. And through most of the time he was there, very few knew he was Jewish. There was one person who he confided in, and that was a Jewish lady who was living up in the mountains. She was from Poland. And at first he thought she was a spy, and he went to her house possibly kill her. I don't know. He didn't know. He was very suspicious of her, and he didn't like the answers he was getting. Finally, she said, "I'm Jewish." Then he sat down. He was standing up the whole time. He sat down. Then he started asking her different questions. Like, what's a menorah? What's the Shema? Things that people who were Jewish would know, and she
Right.
knew all the answers. And so they got to become good friends. And she was married to a doctor who served as a doctor to the Partisans. And so she was helping her husband treat the Partisans after she met my father. And she had actually been training to become a doctor in Italy, but when the Germans took over, they threw her out of school.
Wow. That is so. I have to ask a question, my own question. That is, so your father went through all this and lived under assumed identities, and he got to the United States. Was he observantly Jewish? I mean, by that I don't mean necessarily Orthodox, but did he practice Judaism? Did you grow up?
Yes, we grew up in a Reform temple.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't attend services every week, but we went often, all the major holidays and so on. Yes.
Wow. Well, thank you. The last question I have, and then we'll say goodnight,
Okay.
is I know I want to read this book, and I'm sure many of the people watching would like to purchase the book. How can people get a hold of this?
Well, there's two ways. Amazon.com sells it. They sell it's a paperback version now. It was hardback originally. It's a what they call a quality paperback.
Right.
They sell that, and then there's plenty of booksellers who sell used books on Amazon, and there's hardbacks available there and used paperbacks. But you could also order it directly from the publisher. The University of Illinois Press sells books as well.
Well, terrific. It's called In the Shadow of the Swastika, correct?
Yes, yes.
That would be wonderful. And any of you who are thinking about purchasing it on Amazon, please use Amazon Smile, and a portion of those proceeds will go to the Florida Holocaust
Oh, that's
Museum,
wonderful.
if you can designate us as your Smile recipient. Well, from the bottom of my heart, this has been one of the most fascinating programs we've had. So incredibly grateful for you to spend this evening, especially this important evening of Kristallnacht with us.
Thank you once again for the invitation. I feel so honored to be here.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.